Okay, your assignment is to make white blend into another color, any color you want, any two colors blend together, and to create a sphere that is basically one color. So my sphere is green. This is white blending into blue and yellow blending into red. Now, how you go about doing this is very different than you might think when you first start. So we're going to go back to thinking about the color wheel. And if we want to make this blue, we're going to actually start with orange. So in order to do this, I'm going to start with a really sharp orange colored pencil. It's really important when you're trying to do your thinner layers that your pencil is very, very, very sharp. The harder you're pressing in your later layers is not, it isn't as necessary for it to be as sharp, but in these beginning layers it's going to be very important. Now if you ask, why did I start with orange? Well, if I want the blue to look darker down here, orange is the complement to blue. It's opposite on the color wheel. So if we go back and we look at this color wheel, blue, orange. Orange is the opposite. So that's a good color to start with at the bottom. Now I can come in and can lay my white in up here. And again, keeping it really sharp in the beginning because I want to slowly ease into the other colors. Now, every time we layer a color on top of another color, we're blending. So if I think about what other colors can I bring into a blue, I could bring in some purple. I'm going to bring in a little bit of yellow just because that's a light color. I'm going to bring in a little bit of green. Kind of through the middle area of this. I'm going to come back to my white. Lay in a little bit more. And I'm going to bring in some of my violet blue at the bottom. I'm going to sharpen this pencil because I need this to be thin right now. So sharpening often, especially where you need to slowly build it up, which is in the very beginning. So I'm going to lay that in. So a lot of pencil sharpening. I'm going to come in and get a little bit more of that orange in. I'm going to come in with the lighter blue. Now I want to be able to see some of these other colors coming through, and you build this up in short, neat strokes. So sometimes it's okay to bring in, I'll bring in a little bit of red right here because it'll make it look a little bit richer. I can bring in a little bit more of this orange. I can bring in more of the violet blue. If I were just to go straight from white to blue, this is going to look really flat. So blending requires you layering up quite a few layers. Now there's a couple other things you can do to get this to blend a little bit more. This is called a colorless blender. You can blend simply by doing this. And a lot of times, especially with different textures and things, this is all that you want to do. Some of the color from the paper is coming through. That's why I chose to do this on a piece of colored paper as opposed to white. It's also easier if you can draw on colored paper because you can easily see your whites better. But I can come in and I can use a colorless blender, and it will break down, it has a solvent in the pencil and it breaks down some of this wax that's in the colored pencil, so that's a good way to do that if you're trying to get more of a blended look, so if you don't want to see what's under here. Now on this one, when I get to that step, I'm going to use rubbing alcohol, just regular rubbing alcohol, and the reason I'm going to do that is because you don't always have a colorless blender. Most colored pencil sets do not come with one, so unless you have bought it at the art store, working with rubbing alcohol, or my absolute favorite is rubber cement thinner, as something to break down that colored pencil a little bit. But any of these things work. So if I'm going to come in and I'm going to blend yellow into red, I want this yellow to be really bright yellow, so I am going to bring that and lay this down. But my red, I'm going to start with green. Why am I starting with green? Goes back to the color wheel, because that is a good way to make red darker. So I'm going to lay a little bit of that in. I'm also going to bring in a little bit of this violet blue. Blue tends to be a good way to make red darker. If you think about it, you're making it a little bit purple, which you use red to make purple. So thinking about how you use colors is a good way to go. I'm going to bring in some orange to the middle, because this is going to end up being a lot of orange anyways. And then I'm going to bring in my red. And back to my yellow. As I build up the coats, I can push a little bit harder, but you want to be careful in the beginning not to go too thick too quick. That's a common mistake. And if I'm trying to blend my colors, I want to build them up in layers, and the only way to do that is to start with thin coats. That's why keeping your pencil really sharp in those beginning layers is really important. So now I just have a little bit of the rubbing alcohol in here, and I can come in and just lay that on there a little bit, and that will dry, but that will work to blend it. Now that also thins it down a little bit, so sometimes if you accidentally get a little bit too thick too quick, you can lay that down, let that dry, and then you should be able to come back once it's dry and add a little bit more. I should let that dry a little bit longer, but I could come back and I could build up and add a little bit more to that. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to have you do is to create a sphere. So when this sphere is green, and I made it up here real dark around the edge, this next one I'll have it be a little bit less dramatic, and I'm going to make it just a little bit smaller next to it. Now, notice when I go and I make this, I'm using my whole arm. Okay, then you can come back and trace back over that. A lot of people make the mistake in trying to do this. Okay, no, you use your whole arm. Anytime you're sketching, you want to make sure that you're doing that. You want to think about where you want your light source to come from. So I had it coming from here for this one. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to lay in my white. So I chose to draw this in yellow because yellow will get covered up really easily. It's a very light color, but I can see it on this colored paper. Tend to use a lot of yellow in underneath layers anyways, so if I make a mistake, I can just draw right over top of it. It's better to use colored pencil than to use regular pencil and have a lot of erasure marks. You can draw right over top of this if you make a mistake when you draw. So if I'm going to make this green, I'm going to think about where are the darkest areas. Now, I actually am going to come in and I'm going to lay in just a little bit of black right in here. Now, I rarely use black. I will use it sometimes when I need to make an area really dark on something. but it's always going to be in an underneath layer. And if I have an indigo blue, I'd prefer more times than not to use the indigo blue instead of the black. But sometimes you don't have one, so maybe adding just a little bit in there is good. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to add in my red to this area to make it darker. And I am doing that because red is my complement to green. Now I need to sharpen this red colored pencil because it's getting a little bit on the dull side. I'm going to just lay in a little bit right here. I'm going to bring in some yellow. You use yellow to make green, so that's going to be definitely a good color to like be bringing up into the white for sure. And notice I'm keeping that very, 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 very thin. I'll lay in more white. I always go back to the white and just kind of keep building that up and bringing it down into these colors, because remember, blending, it's about building up colors. So if I just work on these colors down here and not up here, they're not going to like fuse correctly. So you need to kind of keep working on that. I'm going to bring in, I have a little bit of purple here. I'm going to go with my blue violet. I'm going to come back over with some of the yellow. I'm going to come back in with some white again. And then I'm going to come in with my green. And it is okay to see some of these other colors coming through. It makes it a lot more interesting. And sometimes even to leave part of it where there really isn't much green. Sometimes this like final layer of the color that you want it to actually be ends up being a very thin layer. And maybe you like the texture just like that. Or maybe you want to come in and play around with it quite a bit more. Sometimes I'll come in, I like to mix orange into my green. It just makes it not look so fake. Okay, so I've really built that up, and so again, I could come in, I could leave it like that, or I could come in with a colorless blender. Actually, that's not the colorless blender, this is. And the colorless blender also like thins it out a little bit, so I could still come in and build up and add, you know, a little bit more layers of other colors. I could come in with some blues. And at some point you're just going to decide that you're good and that you like it and that this is where you want it to end. So for this exercise, you're going to blend white into a color and then two colors together and make yourself a sphere.